Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you had a good weekend. This begins the next to last week of our class. Um, I have just a few things to note. We have a quiz this week on Arendt. That is your last quiz, and there will be another discussion post created. I will create that either today or tomorrow. Please be sure you're doing those discussion posts. It's a really easy way to get points, and I will give you an extensions as long as you ask for them. Um, don't forget your paper is due Sunday, April 26th. I posted an announcement today regarding the research requirements. So any of the prompts that you choose to do, you need one outside article from JSTOR, and you also need one newspaper editorial. Those are the research requirements for any of the paper prompts, okay? In addition to quoting the class texts. Is there anything else? No, I think that's it. So quiz, discussion post, that's it. And then the paper. Those are your final remaining assignments for the class. I did make an announcement about the final exam last week as well. Please do not forget to get back to me if it's something you're interested in taking. As a reminder, the exam is optional for everyone in the class, even though it is usually the policy that if you have an A, it's optional. It is optional for all of you. If you want to take it and improve your grade, fine. You also obviously risk the chance of hurting your grade, but you do not. It does not hurt your grade if you choose to opt out of it. So just be aware of it. Anyways, that's all I want to say. I want to turn back to Arendt. I want to think more today about her her concept of civil disobedience and how she justifies civil disobedience. Um, we started to dig into this a little bit last week. A lot of what was kind of going on in last week's readings, it was largely negative in the sense that Arendt was trying to show what civil disobedience is not. It is not conscientious objection. It is not mere law breaking. It is not revolution. It is not anarchism. So there are a number of phenomena that Arendt wants to disentangle civil disobedience from, although in Friday's reading she began to give us a sense in which she wants to, excuse me, justify civil disobedience, and that is a constitutional justification grounded in what she calls the spirit of American law. And I'll say more about that today. Something I want to point out to you, though, is that if you are not watching, if you have been watching these lecture videos, I want to point out that what I've uploaded to Canvas in the Arendt lecture notes folder titled Antonini Civil Disobedience, I mentioned this to some of you in class. This was a portion of my dissertation chapter on Arendt, and in this chapter, I consider a lot from this text, and so. If you go ahead and take a look, especially at pages 5 through 12, that gives you it should give you a really good summary, explanation, and analysis of just about everything that is in this text. So please take a look at that. They aren't lecture notes, but they are, again, it's something I wrote, and I think it might help you understand what's going on in Arendt if you're interested. That said, I want to then look at what she says today. Arendt today situates civil disobedience within social contract theory, and talks about how it is that civil disobedience can function as a way to respond to some of the concerns that surround justifying the state or government according to consent. And of course, that came up in social contract theory. So today I think this is a really good way to kind of, in terms of the larger course as a whole, Arendt is giving us a way to kind of really salvage the notion of justifying the government according to consent, which we've dealt with, we've critiqued it in a number of contexts. Arendt today is going to give us an argument for how it is that we can justify consent. So, anyways, I want to look at page 83. So, at the beginning of today's reading, Arendt states very clearly what her argument is. She says, quote, "I shall argue in what follows that although the phenomenon of civil disobedience is today a worldwide phenomenon, and even though it has attracted the interest of jurisprudence and political science only recently, it is still a primarily American in origin and substance." So that's a crucial claim. She's arguing that civil disobedience is a uniquely American phenomenon, and that it can only be made sense of within the context of thinking about the spirit of American law and the spirit of the American Constitution. So she writes, no other country and no other language has even a word for it, and the American Republic is the only government having at least a chance to cope with it. Not perhaps in accordance with the statutes, but in accordance with the spirit of its laws. And that's the crucial claim there. So she'll go on here to continue talking about the spirit of the laws. But when she says, why does she think the American government is the only one that has a chance with coping of it? Well, Arendt looks to the American founding, not just the revolutionary moment when the country was founded, but the pre-revolutionary colonial assemblies in which the colonies were actually engaged in self-government, that all of the citizens actually had a say in constituting the government. And so that's the sense of constitution there. It's not only a thing, but it's also an act. And so she really wants to say that that the American revolutionary experience, not only the war and the founding of the country itself in 1787, but all of the years leading up to that, when it was still when all of the individual colonies were still subject to the crown in Britain, that there was something about the spirit, there was something about the historical circumstances and the kinds of political activities that the colonists were engaged in that gives us a sense of what the spirit of American law and the American Constitution is. So she'll say more, and again, she's getting this concept of the spirit of the laws from something that Montesquieu wrote, titled "The Spirit of the Law." So I want to turn then to page, and I'm where is this at? So if you look at, let me see, page 94. I'm turning here to 94. I have the book in front of me. She defines spirit. The spirit of the laws, as Montesquieu understood it, is the principle by which people living under a particular legal system act and are inspired to act. And Arendt is going to argue consent, the spirit of American laws, is based on the notion of a mutually binding contract which established first the individual colonies and then the Union. Right? So there is where she really, there's this concept of the spirit of the laws. It's a kind of principle that animates a particular form of government. It animates the people to act politically. Within the American system, Arendt is arguing that the spirit of our laws is consent. It is a mutual coming together to consent with each other to act together and to make a promise for the future. That is what consent essentially is that it is a promise to live together. And so that's what's going on here. So when she talks about the spirit of American law, she's talking about consent as the spirit of our laws. That, in other words, for any law to be made and used to regulate our conduct and things like that, Arendt is saying we have to consent to it. Now, again, not necessarily to every single particular statute, but we did indeed agree to the Constitution itself at the founding, and then, as she points out, in each of the individual colonies, to the consent to their individual colonial constitutions. So anyways, that's the spirit of American law. That's a big part of her argument here. That's how she's trying to say that we can preserve consent in the American context based upon the spirit of its laws. So that's an important part of understanding what Arendt is up to here. Now, I want to go back then and look at what she's talking about different social contract theories, um, and she's talking about this on page 84, and so I want to read here from 85 because again, Arendt, everyone points out, one of the common critiques of social contract theory is, of course, we now have with Charles Mills that he was making a historical, thesis, historically descriptive thesis about what actually happened with the social contract. But a common criticism that's often made against Hobbes and Locke is, what are you actually pointing to? When did society come together and get formed in the way you're describing? When we came together out of the state of nature and formed a society and then formed a government, right? And often the critique is made that consent is just a fiction. The state is based on coercion. That's the anarchist critique made by Sartwell. But Arendt here on page 85 says something pretty striking. She says, so let's take a look at this here. So she writes, theoretically, this consent has been construed to be the result of a social contract. Let me see where I was. I lost my place. Which, in its common form, the contract between a people and its government, is indeed easy to denounce as a mere fiction. So that's the critique. But Arendt goes on to say, however, the point is that it was no mere fiction in the American pre-revolutionary experience, with its numerous covenants and agreements, from the Mayflower Compact to the establishment of the 13 colonies as an entity. Right. So she's saying that yes, there is the critique of consent in social contract theory as a kind of theoretical construct, as a fiction, but Arendt is saying not so in the American um, experience, that consent was a reality. So consent was kind of already there in the air. The colonists had a taste of what self-government was like in the colonies. And it kind of, that pre-revolutionary kind of consent informed they already had a taste of it, and so it informed the spirit of the larger American Revolution that would happen, subsequent to the colonies, right? So, anyways, it's an important claim, is that consent was an actual historical reality for the Americans. Now, she goes on then to consider, then she talks about different kinds of contracts within social contract theory. So she's going to make a distinction here between a vertical contract and a horizontal contract. The vertical one is the Hobbesian kind of contract, wherein the government rules over us. We transfer away almost everything to the government, all of our rights, in order for the government to protect it. So she says that there was sex. So I'm on 86 here at the top. There was second, the Hobbesian variety, according to which every individual concludes an agreement with the strictly secular authorities to ensure his safety. I shall call this the vertical version of the social contract. And she's going to argue that that is not the kind of contract that the Americans understood. Yes, in Hobbes there also is the horizontal contract, that we agree to leave the state of nature and then form government. But she thinks that largely the Hobbesian version can largely be thought of as this more authoritative structure where the government rules over us, and that we don't really retain much power to critique the government. Even though the agreement to leave the state of nature is based on consent, we don't really retain much power in order to dissent. Then she's going to go on to consider what she calls the horizontal contract, and she says, third, there was Locke's Aboriginal social contract, which brought about not government but society. The word being understood in the sense of the Latin societas, an alliance between all individual members who contract for their government after they have mutually bound themselves. I shall call this the horizontal version of the contract. This contract limits the power of each individual member, but leaves intact the power of society. Then establishes government upon the plain ground of an original contract among um, individ independent individual. So Arendt's point is, whereas with Hobbes there is the horizontal contract largely goes out the window once you form the government. Whereas with Locke, it's the horizontal contract that legitimizes the vertical contract. And so there is a vertical contract, there is a kind of vertical contract in Locke, but it's this original horizontal contract between each other. It's the agreement between us, not the agreement of government over us, which is vertical, but the horizontal promise and agreement between us. And for Arendt, that captures so much that's true about what political phenomena are, is that it is that politics is concerned with us, the citizens, the in between us, the power that exists between us when we act together. So politics for Arendt is about horizontal power between citizens, not vertical power of government over citizens. It's the horizontal contract that exists between us that legitimates the vertical contract. And again, Arendt is arguing in the case of the United States and the founding of America, this was a historical reality, that the horizontal contract legitimates the vertical contract. And so she wants to say that we can always call upon this historical spirit of the horizontal consent between us. That is what we can call upon when we engage in civil disobedience. We can call upon the original horizontal contract between us that legitimizes the government, and that the government is illegitimate and engages in illegitimate activity. It violates its constitutional promise when it violates this original horizontal contract. I've now done this like 5 times with my hands, so I hope you get the point. So that's an important distinction: the horizontal and the vertical contract. It's the imagery is helpful to see, and it really is going to get us at what is going on with civil disobedience, right? So, and again, I just really want to focus here for a second. So at the bottom of 86 here, Arendt writes, all contracts, covenants, and agreements rest on mutuality. And the great advantage of the horizontal version of the social contract is that this mutuality binds each member to his fellow citizen. This is the only form of government in which people are bound together, not through historical memories or ethnic homogeneity, as in the nation state, and not through Hobbes' Leviathan, which overawes them all and thus unites them, but through the strength of mutual promise. So promising here has political significance for Arendt. Promising is a political action, and that we are binding ourselves to each other when we contract with each other. I bind my fate to your fate, and we promise that the contract will. A promise is a prospective, a forward-looking activity, and that we will renew the contract if we need to. But my fate is binded to your fate through the act of mutual promising. It's horizontal. That no one has any more power over anyone else than me or you in the horizontal contract. Okay. So, anyways, So now Arendt is going to, and the crucial thing she's going to do here on the next page is talk about this problem of tacit consent, because Locke had run into this. That Locke had made his distinction in the second treatise of government between tacit and express consent, but express consent really wasn't a real thing. He ends up saying, what are we supposed to do about those who are born into society? Or what are we supposed to do in the absence of somebody who's given their express consent? Well, he says we can assume that they have consented by the fact that they remain in the country and obey the laws and enjoy the benefits of being there. That is a kind of tacit consent. Of course, the problem is that tacit consent, seems to be really unsatisfactory from the perspective of anything we want to call consent, because consent, we assume, is voluntary, and consent, crucially, it's voluntary, and consent also presupposes that we can withdraw our consent if we want to. So if something is truly voluntary, it presupposes the ability to do otherwise, right? And so that's the problem with tacit consent. But Arendt thinks, look, yes, tacit consent conceptually and theoretically is a problem, but existentially, tacit consent is a historical, or it's a truth that we have to deal with. So she writes here on the bottom of 87. Every man is born a member of a particular community and can survive only if he is welcome and made at home within it. A kind of consent is implied in every newborn's factual situation, namely, a kind of conformity to the rules under which the great game of the world is played in the particular group to which he belongs by birth. We all live and survive by a kind of tacit consent, which, however, it would be difficult to call voluntary. How can we will what is there anyhow? So Arendt is here kind of reflecting existentially upon the fact that tacit consent is existential in the sense that when you're born into the world, you're born into a world that pre-existed you. And so you are kind of this newcomer into this world that pre-exists you, and yet you find yourself having to navigate the fact that you are born as an American, you are born as white or black. All of these things immediately become true about you that you didn't choose upon your birth into the world, and you have to abide by those rules even though you didn't agree to them in the first place. And so tacit consent, while it is problematic from a kind of justifying government perspective, it's a existential reality that all of us have to deal with. Now, what we're not going to say here is we're not just going to say, well, if you don't like the rules, you can leave. That was Locke's response, and that's not what Arendt is going to do here. She's going to say, how can we will what is there anyhow? We might call it voluntary, though, when the child happens to be born into a community in which dissent, a legal and de facto possibility, once he has grown into a man. Dissent implies consent and is the hallmark of free government. One who knows that he may dissent also knows that he somehow consents when he does not dissent. So there it is. That for Arendt, so dissent, she's talking about civil disobedience. And because again, it's uniquely American, because we can at any moment for ourselves reclaim the legitimacy that belongs to us with the horizontal contract that legitimates the vertical contract. Because we can say no to certain kinds of laws that violate that agreement, that violate the constitutional agreement that we form together that legitimates government. When the government violates that, we can say no, because we are the ones legitimizing government. So we can say no. And because we can say no, it also means that when we're not saying no, it seems like we're saying yes. That's not now. So again, this is not mere law breaking. This is dissent for the sake of reclaiming the legitimacy of particular governmental actions that violate the legitimacy of the contract. So it's not mere law breaking. So running a red light is not dissenting. That's just law breaking. Dissenting is public civil disobedience for the sake of changing the law in order to improve the law. So that's what's going on, right? So she says there quite powerfully on 88, she says, consent, as it is implied in the right to dissent, the spirit of American law, and the quintessence of American government spells out and articulates the tacit consent given in exchange for the community's tacit consent, tacit welcome of new arrivals of the inner immigration through which it constantly renews itself, right? So again, she's saying there the tacit consent is not some fiction, but what we're doing, consent is implied in the right to dissent, right? That when we consent, that when we dissent, we know that when we're not dissenting, we are consenting, right? So that does imply that obedience to the law is, in a sense, voluntary. It is truly voluntary, which is what we need to be able to justify the claims about social contract theory. And in the American case, Arendt is saying we can make a case that that obeying the law in terms of not specific constitutional, not specific laws, but in terms of laws or actions that the government engages in that violate the constitutional agreement of the citizens in the horizontal contract. That is how we can make a case for consent through dissent. That's how we can do it, right? So I'm just going to look a little bit more here on page 92. I want you to read some crucial lines. Arendt writes, consent in the American understanding of the term relies on the horizontal version of the social contract and not on majority decisions. On the contrary, much of the thinking of the framers of the Constitution concerned safeguarding for dissenting minorities. The moral content of this consent is like the moral content of all agreements and contracts and consists in the obligation to keep them. So, anyways, that is a lot of what's so there's some more things going on in today's reading, but that I just wanted to make sure I covered those crucial points. And again, I do encourage you to take a look at that the thing titled Antonini's Civil Disobedience there in the lecture notes, because again, Arendt's argument here is crucial for trying to salvage some form of consent in understanding in the American context why in the American context we can make arguments about something like the spirit of the law and the spirit of the Constitution that was contained in those sort of original acts by the colonists and the founders in terms of this horizontal contract. That was what legitimated government, and when we engage in civil disobedience, we are simply reclaiming the legitimacy that belongs to us in the first place. And that's what's going on. We are asking the government to keep its promise. And we are simply, when we engage in civil disobedience, we are coming together. We are promising each other. We are engaged in consent. We are engaged in dissent, but what we're doing when we engage in dissent is we are reminding the government of that original consent that we gave in order to legitimate them. So that's all I'm going to say. I hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and I will talk to you all soon. I will maybe make one more video this week on Arendt, but I think I've got 4 videos on Arendt now. So if you are planning to do a paper on her or study for the quizzes, I think you've got enough to work with. Take care.